The hospital room was quiet, save for the faint beeping of machines and the occasional rustle of fabric as nurses moved about. Sarah lay on the bed, her face pale and streaked with tears. Her hands trembled as she clutched the edge of the blanket covering her. Beside her, Mark sat stiffly in a chair, his jaw clenched tight, trying to hold himself together for his wife's sake. But his red-rimmed eyes betrayed the storm of emotions raging inside him. This wasn't how it was supposed to go. They had dreamed of this day for so long. 2 babies, a perfect pair of twins entering their lives. Instead, joy had turned into heartbreak. Earlier that morning, the delivery had seemed normal at first. The doctors assured them everything was fine. But then came the complications. Liam, the first twin, arrived screaming into the world, tiny fists flailing and lungs strong. His cries filled the room, bringing both relief and hope. But when Ethan followed moments later, there was only silence. No cry, no movement. The medical team sprang into action, working frantically to revive him. But after several agonizing minutes, they stepped back, shaking their heads. There was nothing more they could do. Ethan was stillborn. Sarah broke down completely, sobbing uncontrollably as Mark wrapped his arms around her. He didn't know what to say or do. No words could ease the pain of losing a child. The nurse gently took Ethan from the doctor's hands, wrapping him in a soft white blanket before placing him in Sarah's arms. "Would you like some time alone with him?" the nurse asked softly. Sarah nodded through her tears, unable to speak. Mark reached out and touched Ethan's cheek, marveling at how small and peaceful he looked despite the tragedy. Outside the room, 5-year-old Noah waited anxiously with his grandmother. He didn't fully understand what was happening, but he knew something was wrong. His mom had been gone for hours, and now Grandma kept glancing at the closed door, her expression worried. "When can I see Mommy?" Noah asked for the 3rd time that hour. His grandmother knelt beside him, smoothing his hair. "Soon, sweetheart," she promised, though her voice wavered slightly. "But we need to wait just a little longer." Inside the room, Sarah finally managed to compose herself enough to ask about Noah. "He should meet his brother," she said quietly, her voice cracking. Mark hesitated, unsure if it was a good idea. How do you explain death to a child? But Sarah insisted. "He deserves to say goodbye," she whispered. Reluctantly, Mark agreed and stepped out to fetch Noah. As he approached the waiting area, he forced a smile for his son's sake, even though his heart felt heavy. "Hey, buddy," he said, kneeling down. "Mommy wants to introduce you to your new brothers." Noah's eyes lit up with excitement. "Both of them?" he asked eagerly. Mark swallowed hard, nodding. "Yes, both of them." Hand in hand, they walked back to the hospital room, neither of them knowing how much this moment would change everything. When Mark pushed open the door to the hospital room, Noah hesitated for a moment, his small hand gripping his father's tightly. The air inside felt different, thicker, quieter, as if the room itself was holding its breath. Sarah sat upright in the bed, her face pale but calm, with one arm cradling Liam, who squirmed and cooed softly in his blue blanket. In her other arm lay Ethan, wrapped snugly in a white blanket, perfectly still. Noah's eyes darted between the 2 bundles, confusion flickering across his face. "Come here, sweetheart," Sarah said gently, patting the edge of the bed. Noah stepped closer, clutching his favorite stuffed bear, a worn-out brown teddy named Mr. Buttons, that he never went anywhere without. His grandmother had told him this would be a special day, but nothing about it felt special to him now. He climbed onto the chair next to the bed, peeking over the edge at the babies. "This is Liam," Sarah said, nodding toward the wriggling bundle. "He's your little brother. Can you say hi?" Noah leaned forward, his nose wrinkling as Liam let out a tiny squeak. "Hi, Liam," Noah whispered shyly, waving his fingers. Then his gaze shifted to the other baby, the one who wasn't moving. "And this is Ethan," Sarah continued, her voice trembling just enough for Noah to notice. She paused, searching for the right words. How do you explain something so heartbreaking to a child? Noah tilted his head, studying Ethan. Why isn't he making noises like Liam? He asked innocently. Sarah exchanged a glance with Mark, who stood silently by the doorway, his hands shoved deep into his pockets. Taking a deep breath, she pulled Noah closer, resting a hand on his shoulder. Ethan didn't get to stay with us. Sweetheart, she began carefully. Sometimes babies are too sick or too tired to come all the way into the world. And even though we wanted him to be here with us, he had to go to heaven instead. Noah blinked, digesting her words. Heaven was a place Grandma talked about sometimes, a happy place where people went when they left Earth. But Ethan was right there in front of him, tucked safely in his mother's arms. So, he's not coming home with us? Noah asked, his brow furrowing. Sarah shook her head, tears welling up again. No, baby. He won't be coming home. Her voice broke on the last word, and she quickly looked away, trying to compose herself. For a long moment, Noah didn't say anything. He stared at Ethan, his expression unreadable. Then, very slowly, he reached out a tentative hand, brushing the tip of his finger against the soft fabric of the blanket. Can I talk to him? He asked suddenly, surprising both Sarah and Mark. They glanced at each other, unsure how to respond. Finally, Sarah nodded. Of course, sweetie. You can tell him whatever you want. Noah leaned closer, his lips pursed thoughtfully. For a few seconds, he simply looked at Ethan, as if deciding what to say. Then, in a soft voice meant only for his brother, he began to speak. Hi, Ethan. I'm Noah. I'm your big brother. He paused, glancing back at Sarah and Mark before continuing. I wish you could come home with us. We have lots of toys, and I'd share them with you. Even Mr. Buttons. He patted the stuffed bear tucked under his arm. But if you really have to go to heaven, that's okay. Just promise me to watch over us from there, okay? Sarah bit her lip, tears streaming down her cheeks. Mark turned away, wiping his own eyes with the back of his hand. It was almost unbearable watching their son navigate such a profound loss with such innocence and grace. Noah leaned even closer, pressing his forehead lightly against the blanket. Goodbye, Ethan, he murmured. I love you. The room fell silent except for the faint hum of the machines and the occasional rustle of fabric. Noah sat back, staring at Ethan for another moment before turning to his parents. Did he hear me? He asked earnestly. Sarah managed a watery smile, pulling him into a hug. I think he did, sweetheart. I really think he did. Little did they know, those simple words, and the love behind them, would soon spark something extraordinary. Noah sat quietly for a moment, his small frame still pressed close to Sarah as she held him in a tight embrace. His gaze kept drifting back to Ethan, who lay motionless in her arms. The room was heavy with sadness, but Noah didn't seem weighed down by it the way the adults were. Instead, he watched Ethan with an intensity that surprised both Sarah and Mark. He wasn't crying or asking more questions, just observing, as if trying to understand something no one else could see. After a while, Noah broke the silence. Ethan looks like he's sleeping, he said softly, tilting his head. Sarah nodded, managing a faint smile through her tears. Yes, sweetheart, he does. But remember what I told you. He's not going to wake up. Noah frowned slightly, considering this. Why not? He asked, his voice tinged with curiosity rather than frustration. Mark stepped closer, kneeling beside the bed so he could meet his son's eyes. Sometimes, when babies are very sick or too little, their bodies can't stay awake anymore, he explained gently. But even though Ethan isn't here with us, he'll always be in our hearts. Noah nodded slowly, as if processing the explanation. Then, without warning, his face brightened just a little. I know what will help, he declared, sitting up straighter. Before anyone could ask what he meant, he began rummaging through the small bag Grandma had packed for him earlier. After a few seconds, he pulled out a small music box, a gift from his last birthday. It was painted with stars and moons, and when opened, it played a soft, tinkling lullaby. Sarah raised an eyebrow, unsure where this was going. "What are you doing, sweetie?" she asked. Noah grinned shyly, holding the music box close to Ethan. "If Ethan is sleeping, maybe he needs a song to feel better," he said matter-of-factly. Without waiting for permission, he wound up the tiny key on the side of the box and let the melody fill the room. The gentle notes seemed to float around them, cutting through the heaviness of the moment like sunlight breaking through clouds. As the music played, Noah leaned closer to Ethan again. This time, instead of speaking, he started singing along in his clear, high-pitched voice. The words weren't anything special, just fragments of songs he'd heard Sarah hum over the years, but there was something pure and heartfelt about the way he sang. "Sleep, little baby, don't you cry," he crooned softly, his eyes fixed on Ethan. "Dream of the stars in the big night sky." Mark and Sarah exchanged glances, their hearts swelling with emotion. They had expected anger, confusion, or even despair from their young son. But instead, Noah was showing them a kind of grace they hadn't anticipated. There was no fear or hesitation in his actions, only love and acceptance. It was as if he instinctively understood that Ethan needed comfort, even if he couldn't respond. When the music box wound down, and the final note faded into silence, Noah stopped singing and sat back, looking pleased with himself. "Do you think he liked it?" he asked, turning to Sarah. She swallowed hard, forcing herself to speak past the lump in her throat. "I think he loved it, sweetheart," she whispered, pulling him into another hug. "You have such a big heart." For a moment, everything seemed peaceful. The weight of the day's tragedy felt just a little lighter, thanks to Noah's simple act of kindness. But then, as Noah leaned forward once more to kiss Ethan's forehead and whisper a final goodbye, something extraordinary happened. Time itself seemed to pause, freezing the room, and everyone in it, in place. The clock on the wall stopped ticking. The machines monitoring Sarah's vitals went silent, and even the faint hum of the lights above disappeared. Only Noah remained unaffected, standing by the bed with wide eyes, looking around curiously at the sudden stillness. And somewhere in that frozen silence, a faint sound began to emerge, a sound no one thought they'd ever hear again. The moment the room froze, it felt as though the entire world had been placed on pause. The air grew thick, almost electric, and every sound vanished completely. The steady beeping of the heart monitor beside Sarah's bed stopped mid-tone, leaving an eerie silence in its place. The second hand on the clock above the door hung suspended, refusing to move forward. Even the faint buzzing of the fluorescent lights overhead faded into nothingness. Everything was still, too still. Noah, however, didn't notice any of this at first. To him, the room seemed exactly the same, except quieter. He blinked a few times, glancing around curiously. "Why is everyone so quiet?" he murmured to himself, his voice the only noise in the otherwise frozen space. His parents stood frozen in their positions, Sarah halfway through hugging him, her tear-streaked face locked in an expression of sorrow. Mark crouched near the bed, his hand raised as if about to say something, but never quite getting there. The nurse who had been adjusting Ethan's blanket stood motionless by the doorway, her pen hovering inches above her clipboard. At first, Noah thought maybe everyone was playing some kind of game. "Are we pretending to be statues?" he asked aloud, giggling softly. But when no one responded, not even a twitch or a blink, he began to feel uneasy. He waved his hand in front of Sarah's face, calling out, "Mommy, Daddy?" Still nothing. Panic started to creep into his chest, making his heart race. What was happening? Why wasn't anyone moving? Then, just as quickly as the stillness had settled, a faint sound pierced through the silence. A soft, barely audible cry. It was so quiet that Noah almost missed it, but his sharp ears caught the tiny whimper immediately. His head snapped toward the source of the sound, his eyes widening in disbelief. The cry was coming from Ethan. "No way," Noah whispered, scrambling closer to the bundle in Sarah's arms. He reached out hesitantly, afraid to touch Ethan at first, but the cries grew louder, weak and shaky, but unmistakably real. They weren't the robust wails of a healthy newborn like Liam's, but they were enough to send shivers down Noah's spine. He stared at Ethan, his mouth hanging open in awe. "Ethan, you're awake," he breathed, his voice trembling with excitement. As the cries continued, Noah leaned closer, his earlier fear replaced by wonder. "I knew you'd hear me," he exclaimed, his grin spreading ear to ear. He wanted to shout for his parents, to tell them what was happening, but they were still frozen, unable to respond. For a brief moment, he felt a pang of loneliness, wishing someone else could share in this incredible moment. But then he realized he was the only one who could help Ethan now. Reaching out carefully, Noah touched the edge of the blanket wrapped around Ethan. The fabric felt warm beneath his fingers, and for the first time since entering the hospital room, he felt a spark of hope. "It's okay, Ethan," he whispered soothingly, mimicking the way Sarah comforted him when he was scared. "You're safe. We're here." As if responding to Noah's words, Ethan let out another weak cry, this one stronger than before. Noah laughed softly, tears welling up in his own eyes. "You're really back," he said, his voice full of awe. "I told you I'd take care of you." And then, just as suddenly as it had begun, the strange stillness lifted, the clock resumed ticking, the machines beeped back to life, and the faint hum of the lights returned. Sarah gasped, snapping out of her frozen state, while Mark blinked rapidly, looking around in confusion. The nurse dropped her pen in surprise, staring at the scene unfolding before her. Everyone turned toward Noah, who was standing by the bed, his face glowing with joy. "Ethan's awake," Noah shouted, pointing excitedly at the bundle in Sarah's arms. At first, no one believed him. They thought it must be a mistake, a trick of the mind brought on by grief. But then, as if to prove him right, Ethan let out another cry, louder and more insistent this time. The room erupted into chaos as the medical staff rushed in, their faces a mixture of shock and disbelief. Sarah clutched Ethan tightly, tears streaming down her face once again. But this time, they were tears of joy. Mark stumbled forward, his hands shaking as he gazed at his son. How is this possible?" he stammered, his voice barely above a whisper. But Noah simply smiled, knowing deep down that sometimes miracles didn't need explanations. The room buzzed with frantic energy as the medical team surrounded Sarah's bed, their movements quick and precise. Ethan's cries, though weak, had sent shockwaves through everyone present. Nurses called for doctors, machines were adjusted, and monitors were hooked up again in a flurry of activity. Sarah clutched Ethan tightly to her chest, unable to believe what was happening. Her tears flowed freely now, but they weren't tears of sorrow anymore. They were tears of disbelief, gratitude, and overwhelming joy. Mark stood frozen beside her, his hands trembling as he watched the scene unfold. This can't be real," he muttered under his breath, shaking his head. He glanced at Noah, who stood calmly by the bedside, his expression one of quiet confidence. Unlike the adults, Noah didn't seem surprised or overwhelmed. To him, it felt like the most natural thing in the world, as if he'd always known Ethan would wake up. "Did you see that, Daddy?" Noah asked, tugging lightly on Mark's sleeve. His big brown eyes sparkled with excitement. "I told you Ethan would come back." Mark knelt down, pulling his son into a tight hug. "You did, buddy," he said hoarsely, his voice thick with emotion. "You really did." He wanted to ask Noah how he'd known, how he'd managed to do something no doctor or machine could accomplish, but the words caught in his throat. Instead, he simply held his boy close, marveling at the miracle unfolding before them. Meanwhile, the medical staff worked tirelessly to assess Ethan's condition. A pediatrician arrived within minutes, her face pale with astonishment as she examined the baby. "This is unprecedented," she murmured, checking Ethan's vitals over and over. "There's no explanation for this. His heart rate is stable. His lungs are functioning. He's alive." She looked up at Sarah and Mark, her professional demeanor giving way to awe. "Whatever happened here, it's nothing short of extraordinary." Sarah barely heard the doctor's words. Her focus was entirely on Ethan, whose cries had softened into tiny whimpers. She stroked his cheek gently, whispering prayers of thanks under her breath. "My baby," she whispered, her voice cracking. "You came back to us." Beside her, Mark reached out to touch Ethan's hand, his fingers brushing against the impossibly small digits. For the first time since entering the hospital, he allowed himself to feel hope, to truly believe that their family might still have a future together. Noah, meanwhile, remained unfazed by the chaos around him. While the adults scrambled to make sense of the situation, he simply watched Ethan with a knowing smile. When the nurse tried to take Ethan from Sarah to run further tests, Noah stepped forward, placing a protective hand on the blanket. "Be careful with him," he said firmly, his tone surprising everyone in the room. The nurse hesitated, then nodded, carefully lifting Ethan into her arms. As Ethan was taken to the neonatal intensive care unit, NICU, Sarah and Mark followed closely behind, their hearts pounding with a mix of fear and relief. Noah trailed after them, clutching Mr. Buttons tightly. Despite everything, he seemed completely at ease, skipping along as if he hadn't just witnessed the impossible. When they reached the NICU, the nurses assured Sarah and Mark that Ethan would be monitored closely overnight to ensure his health stabilized. While the doctors worked, Sarah turned to Noah, kneeling down so she could look him in the eye. "Sweetheart," she began, her voice trembling, "what happened back there? How did you know Ethan would wake up?" Noah shrugged, his expression thoughtful. "I just talked to him," he said simply, "and I sang to him because I thought he might like it. He listened, Mommy. I could tell." Sarah pulled him into another hug, overwhelmed by his innocence and wisdom. She didn't understand how Noah had done it, how he'd reached Ethan when no one else could. But she didn't need answers right now. All that mattered was that her baby boy was alive. As the hours passed, the news of Ethan's miraculous recovery spread throughout the hospital. Nurses whispered about it in the hallways, doctors shook their heads in disbelief, and even strangers stopped by the NICU window to catch a glimpse of the baby who had defied all odds. For Sarah and Mark, the day had transformed from one of unimaginable loss into one of unexplainable joy. And as they sat together, holding hands and watching over their newborn sons, they couldn't help but feel that something, or someone, had intervened to give them a second chance. The days that followed Ethan's miraculous awakening were a whirlwind of tests, questions, and quiet celebrations. The hospital staff couldn't stop talking about what had happened. Nurses who had been skeptical at first found themselves peeking into the NICU just to see Ethan for themselves. Doctors pored over his charts, searching for any medical explanation, but no matter how many scans they ran or blood samples they analyzed, there was nothing unusual to explain why a baby declared stillborn had suddenly come back to life. It was as if science itself had been defied. Sarah and Mark spent every waking moment by their sons' sides. Liam, the healthier twin, was already showing signs of a feisty personality, wiggling and cooing whenever anyone held him. Ethan, on the other hand, remained fragile but steady, his tiny body fighting hard to catch up with his brother. Watching them together filled Sarah with both gratitude and heartache. She knew they'd come so close to losing Ethan forever, and the thought made her hug him even tighter when she held him. Noah, meanwhile, became something of a legend in the hospital. Staff members often stopped to chat with him, asking gentle questions about what he remembered from that day. "Do you think you did something special to help your brother?" one nurse asked during one of her visits. Noah tilted his head, considering the question seriously before nodding. "I think Ethan heard me," he said confidently, "and I think he wanted to stay." His simple answer left everyone speechless. There was no arrogance in his tone, just pure conviction, as though he truly believed he played a role in bringing Ethan back. Sarah and Mark exchanged glances whenever people brought it up, unsure how to respond. They didn't doubt Noah's sincerity. He was too young to lie or exaggerate. But they also couldn't fully grasp what had happened. Was it his innocence, his love, or was there something more to their son than they had ever realized? As word of Ethan's recovery spread beyond the hospital walls, friends, family, and even strangers began reaching out to offer their support. Some called it a miracle. Others referred to it as divine intervention. The local pastor visited the family, offering prayers and blessings, while distant relatives sent cards and messages of encouragement. Even the news media caught wind of the story, though Sarah politely declined interviews, wanting to keep the focus on her family's healing rather than public attention. Despite all the excitement surrounding Ethan, Noah remained unchanged. He continued to visit his brothers daily, bringing Mr. Buttons along for company. Each time he entered the NICU, he greeted Ethan with a cheerful smile, as if he expected him to start giggling any moment. "You're getting stronger, aren't you?" he'd say, patting the glass incubator gently. Then he'd turn to Liam, making silly faces until the older twin kicked his legs in delight. To Noah, the twins weren't miracles. They were simply his brothers, and he loved them fiercely. One evening, after the hospital corridors had grown quiet, Sarah sat alone in the NICU rocking chair, holding Ethan close. Mark had taken Noah home for dinner, promising to return soon. As she gazed down at her newborn son, her mind drifted back to the frozen moment in the delivery room, the eerie silence, the impossible cry, and Noah's unwavering certainty. She replayed the scene over and over in her head, trying to piece together how it had all unfolded. "Was it you, Noah?" she whispered softly, brushing a finger against Ethan's cheek. "Did you do something we can't understand?" Tears welled up in her eyes again. But this time, they weren't tears of sadness. They were tears of wonder, for the bond between her boys, for the resilience of life, and for the mysteries of the universe that defied logic. When Mark returned later that night, he found Sarah still sitting in the rocker, humming softly to Ethan. He leaned against the doorway, watching them for a moment before stepping inside. "How's our little fighter doing?" he asked, his voice low and warm. Sarah looked up, smiling through her exhaustion. "He's perfect," she replied, her voice trembling with emotion. "They both are." As they sat together in the dimly lit room, listening to the rhythmic beeping of the monitors and the soft hum of the machines, they allowed themselves to dream again. Dream of birthdays and school plays, of scraped knees and bedtime stories, of a future where their family would grow and thrive, bound together not just by biology, but by an unbreakable connection forged in the most extraordinary of circumstances. Whatever force had intervened to save Ethan, it had given them more than just a second chance. It had reminded them of the power of hope, faith, and unconditional love. Weeks passed, and Ethan continued to grow stronger with each passing day. The doctors were astonished by his progress. From a baby who had once been declared stillborn, he was now thriving, gaining weight, responding to sounds, and even gripping fingers with surprising strength. Every milestone felt like a victory, not just for Sarah and Mark, but for everyone who had witnessed the miracle. Yet despite all the medical advancements and explanations offered, no one could fully unravel how Ethan had come back to life. It remained an enigma, a story whispered about in hushed tones throughout the hospital. Sarah and Mark found themselves reflecting on that fateful day more often than they cared to admit. They replayed every detail: the frozen room, the inexplicable silence, Noah's calm demeanor, and Ethan's sudden cry. Each time they thought about it, their hearts swelled with gratitude, but also with questions. Was it divine intervention, a glitch in the universe, or was there something extraordinary about Noah himself? Noah, of course, showed no signs of being affected by the lingering mystery. To him, Ethan waking up wasn't strange or miraculous. It was simply right. He treated his younger brother like any other sibling, chatting with him during diaper changes, making silly faces to make him smile, and occasionally scolding him when he cried too loudly. "Don't be so loud, Ethan," he'd say with mock seriousness, wagging a finger. "You'll wake Liam." But the adults around them couldn't shake the feeling that Noah held some kind of secret. Friends and family members began asking subtle questions, hoping to uncover clues without prying too deeply. One afternoon, while Sarah was feeding Liam, her mother-in-law gently broached the subject. "Do you think Noah knew something we didn't?" she asked, glancing at the boy playing quietly with his stuffed bear nearby. "He seemed so sure that Ethan would wake up." Sarah sighed, adjusting Liam in her arms. "I've thought about it a lot," she admitted, "but I don't know if knew is the right word. Maybe he just believed differently than we did. Children see the world in ways we forget how to as adults." Her mother-in-law nodded thoughtfully, but the question lingered in the air, unanswered. Mark, too, wrestled with the idea. Late at night, after tucking Noah into bed and checking on the twins, he'd sit alone in the living room, staring at old photographs of his family. In one picture, taken only days before Ethan's birth, Noah stood proudly beside Sarah's pregnant belly, grinning ear to ear. His innocence radiated from the photo, reminding Mark of the pure, unshakable faith his son had shown in the delivery room. Could it be possible that Noah's love, and perhaps his belief in something greater, had somehow reached Ethan when nothing else could? Theories swirled among those who heard the story. Some leaned toward religious explanations, calling it a sign of God's grace. Others suggested it might have been an anomaly, a rare medical phenomenon yet to be understood. But Sarah and Mark refused to settle on any single explanation. For them, what mattered most was the outcome. Ethan was alive, and their family was whole again. Still, the memory of Noah's role in the event stayed with them. They noticed little things, how he always seemed to know when Ethan needed comforting, how he spoke to him as though Ethan understood every word. Once, when Ethan started fussing inconsolably during a late-night feeding, Noah appeared in the doorway, rubbing his eyes sleepily. Without saying a word, he climbed onto Sarah's lap and placed his hand over Ethan's chest. Within moments, Ethan calmed down, drifting off to sleep. Sarah stared at her son in awe, wondering silently if there was more to him than met the eye. Despite the unanswered questions, life slowly returned to a semblance of normalcy. Sarah and Mark focused on caring for their boys, cherishing every moment together. They documented everything, from Ethan's first real smile to Liam's attempts to roll over, with photos and journal entries, determined to preserve these early memories forever. And through it all, Noah remained their steadfast anchor, his unwavering love for his brothers keeping the family grounded. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in hues of orange and pink, Sarah sat on the porch swing with Noah curled up beside her. Ethan slept peacefully in a bassinet nearby, while Liam napped inside. She wrapped an arm around her eldest son, pulling him close. "You're such a good big brother," she said softly, kissing the top of his head. Noah smiled up at her, his eyes shining. "I told you I'd take care of them," he replied matter-of-factly. In that moment, Sarah realized she didn't need answers. Whether it was fate, faith, or something beyond human understanding, what mattered most was the bond between her children, and the love that connected them all. Whatever force had brought Ethan, months later, life had settled into a rhythm that felt almost normal. Ethan grew stronger with each passing day, his once fragile body now robust and full of energy. He was starting to catch up to Liam, who was already rolling over and reaching for toys with determination. The twins' personalities were beginning to shine through. Liam, bold and curious, always grabbing at whatever he could get his hands on. Ethan, quieter but observant, watching the world around him with wide, thoughtful eyes. Together, they filled the house with laughter, cries, and the kind of chaos only babies could create. Noah thrived in his role as the big brother. He took his responsibilities seriously, often volunteering to help during feedings or diaper changes. When Sarah needed a break, he'd sit beside the bassinets, reading stories aloud from his favorite picture books. His voice carried a warmth that seemed to soothe both babies instantly. Sometimes, when Ethan fussed and nothing else worked, Noah would hum the same lullaby he'd sung in the hospital room. In those moments, Ethan would quiet down, his tiny hand reaching out toward his older brother as if recognizing the melody. Sarah and Mark marveled at the bond between their sons. It wasn't just the connection between Liam and Ethan. It was the way Noah treated them like equals, despite their age difference. To him, they weren't just babies. They were people with thoughts, feelings, and dreams of their own. They'll grow up to be best friends, Noah declared one evening as he tucked Mr. Buttons into bed beside the twins. Sarah smiled, her heart swelling with pride. She hoped he was right. As time went on, the memory of that miraculous day became less about unanswered questions and more about gratitude. Sarah stopped searching for explanations, realizing that some things were meant to remain mysteries. What mattered most was the outcome. Their family was whole, and every moment together was a gift. Mark often joked that Noah must have superpowers, given how effortlessly he seemed to understand his brothers. But deep down, they both knew it wasn't about powers, it was about love. Pure, simple, unshakable love. The community hadn't forgotten the story either. Neighbors frequently stopped by to check on the family, bringing meals, clothes, and toys for the boys. Strangers at the grocery store recognized Sarah and Mark, offering words of encouragement or simply thanking them for sharing their story. One elderly woman even approached them in tears, saying, "Your son's faith gave me hope when I thought there was none left." It reminded them that their journey had touched lives far beyond their own. On special occasions, like birthdays or holidays, Sarah made sure to document everything. She snapped photos of Noah holding the twins, their tiny faces scrunched up in identical expressions of wonder. She wrote letters to each of her children, pouring her heart onto paper so they'd someday understand how much they meant to her. For Ethan, she added an extra note. "You taught us that miracles are real and that love can move mountains." One sunny afternoon, as the family gathered in the backyard for a picnic, Noah sat cross-legged on the grass, holding Ethan securely in his lap, while Liam babbled happily nearby. Sarah watched from a distance, her camera ready to capture the perfect shot. As she clicked the button, she noticed something remarkable. Noah leaned closer to Ethan, whispering something only his little brother could hear. Then, as if responding, Ethan let out a gurgle, a sound halfway between a laugh and a coo. Noah grinned, looking up at Sarah with sparkling eyes. "He likes my joke," he announced proudly. In that moment, Sarah realized something profound. Life wasn't about finding answers to every question. It was about embracing the beauty of the unknown. Their family story was proof that even in the darkest times, light could break through. Whether it came from divine intervention, the power of belief, or simply the unbreakable bond between siblings, it didn't matter. What mattered was that they had been given a second chance, and they weren't going to waste it. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting golden rays across the yard, Sarah wrapped her arms around her family, pulling them close. They were flawed, imperfect, and beautifully human, but they were also strong, resilient, and bound together by love. And as long as they had each other, they knew they could face anything the future held.